Yeah, Professor. Parag, you need to be there in the bookstore. Meeting 6 p.m. Yeah.
Hello.
I do remember that we went to the bank.
स्पीकर बंद कर दीजिए मैं अभी मारू चालू कर दी दुकान मारू तो हमने ये बंद कर चालू करें तो चालू कर सारा माइक्रो हां म्यूट लग गया કારણ કે આમાં જો આપણે જાય કોન્ટેક્ટ કરવા રહી છે ત્યાં સુધી ઘણો ટાઈમ લાગે સારી રીતે ચાલુ કરે
વિસલ નહીં થાય ને
ના સર સ્પીડ માં ટેપ કરી
તમને ખબર છે ને આપણે
હા આગે खाली हम लोग को साथ તમે અનમ્યુટ છો અનમ્યુટ મત કરી શકે કરना મારા भी करना ले ये करना तो પછી એમને ઓનલી હોસ્ટ જ કરી દીધું ઓનલી ડન
आप फाइट करते हो बाहर कितने का people come and address the
I feel awkward.
Just message saying we'll be starting shortly. People who are in lockdown don't see. No, I
Yeah, they look nicer. Hi, Naushad.
Hi, Pankaj. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
I'm-
You just
Hi, Nashad.
Hi, Rakesh. I'm sorry I'm not with you in your nice bookshop.
Next round.
next round is there. Yeah. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. It is just this is, by the way, a gathering of the friends. And but it is such a pleasure to have Professor Rakesh Basant and Dr. Naushad Forbes here. I'll take a few minutes to talk about Rakesh and Naushad, and at the same time, then we'll start the conversation. Those of you who are on the on Zoom and on YouTube, welcome this evening to this wonderful conversation around the book, The Black Box, Innovation and Public Policy in India. Rakesh and I joined about the same time at IIM Ahmedabad in 1994. I think, Rakesh, you came in couple of months earlier. And one evening, the then director, Pradeep Khandwala, called both of us to his home for a cup of tea. And Rakesh was working on agriculture technology, and I was doing operations and manufacturing. And he chatted with us, and he introduced us to each other and said, you might have something in common. And then we started to think about it, and we said, okay, let's start writing our perspectives on technology. Rakesh, as you all know, is an economist, did his PhD here, and also spent very interesting years at CDS Trivandrum, and then he spent a year or two at Yale before coming back to IIM Ahmedabad. And we started to say, what is it that's in common between an operations management person and an economist from a technology and innovation perspective? And that really was the starting point of, for me, which was really more than a decade-long phenomenal learning experience working with Rakesh. We taught courses together. We wrote papers together. I may have written the maximum number of papers with you, Rakesh. And we co-guided students together. And at the same time, Rakesh is one of those very rare academics who brings in very patient perspective on issues, and patient perspective is always very deep. And I think this is what you will you see in this book, The Black Box, and Rakesh will talk a little bit about it as we kind of go along. I don't think we could have found a better person than him to really put a very broad picture with enormous amount of details on what is happening to the world of innovation and technology across the world and also in India, and also sorting out many of the conceptual issues that are part of this world. I have to also introduce Naushad, and we invited Naushad to IIM Ahmedabad for a talk. And as many of you know, first and foremost, that he's on a board of governors. And but Naushad has had, and I think such a phenomenal vantage point for looking at aspects of innovation, technology, and the economy. As a student of this domain, I mean, he has his bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Stanford. He's taught their courses over long periods. There's an academic there in Naushad. He runs and leads an organization which is a very technologically driven and led organization, Forbes Marshall, which works on steam engineering and control instrumentation, a very highly deep engineering driven company. And then I think Naushad was, as a past president of CII in 2016 and 17, really was very close to how policy making was happening in the country. And I think we've had lots of opportunities to understand from Naushad how the economy in general benefits tremendously from the world of innovation and technological change, and no better person than him to be with us. So welcome, Naushad. I wish you were here, but we will have another occasion, I'm sure, when your book comes out sooner than later to be here. By the way, I mean, there is a book coming out. So this is an insider's information here. So so welcome all of you to this conversation with Rakesh and Naushad around Rakesh's book, but in general around what's happening to innovate. There are very few people, by the way, as we were talking the other day, who understand this linkage very well on why innovation and what does it do to a nation. And I think I hope we can move in that direction as we go on. I have to also mention that Naushad is chairman of a very interesting center in Pune called Center for Technology, Innovation and Economic Research. That's also led by Janak, who's here. Janak, glad that you could travel. And that's Center STEER is putting out enormous amount of work around India on innovation, technology, R&D, and aspects around it. So we'll hopefully, those of you who don't know much about it, please look at the website. There's a most recent report from STEER that has come out, which is in our library. And in fact, all our libraries, all our reading rooms. So you should be able to get a copy. With that introduction to you, Rakesh, let's hear your perspective on the book. What got you to write it, and tell us a little bit more about it.
Okay, thank you very much, Pankaj. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all of you who are here. as Pankaj mentioned, we started doing some things together way back in 96, 97. And those of you who will see the book would know that the origins of the book actually lie there in that course that we did together. When Pankaj told me that you sort of put together in a 15 minutes what's there in the book, I was not very sure what one should be focusing on. But so I have sort of thought through some of these things which I'll share with you, but I'm hoping that the conversation afterwards will be able to capture a larger set of issues which may not come through in my initial presentation. So if you, when I started to think about the book, the idea essentially was to do some kind of a broad brush, large canvas exercise to figure out how does one look at this linkage between innovation and public policy. And the endeavor was to bring out this linkage in as nuanced a manner as possible and articulate it in a manner which is somewhat accessible, not only to operations and economics people, but to other academics and managers and this as well. So if I have to summarize what is some of the main arguments of the book, I would say there are three interrelated parts to the book. I argue that any public policy which wants to do something on innovation in the economy has to understand what innovation means in all its dimension. And if you don't understand the nature of technological innovation, it's likely that the policy would go wrong. So that's one argument, and I'll elaborate on that in a little bit. The other argument that I have put together is that one should not be looking at innovation policy through the narrow lens of IPR policy or R&D policy. For me, an innovation policy instrument is any instrument which affects firm level choices with respect to technology and innovation. So once you broaden the scope of what influences innovation related decisions at firm level, virtually all policies can be seen as for instruments for innovation policy. So the second argument which I try to put together is that one should have a broader perspective on what innovation policy is, and sort of one should be looking at all kinds of policy instruments. And the third part of the book is focusing on a few themes where I personally think that the policymakers should be focusing on, because the immediate need for us is to build technological capabilities. And in order to do that, the book identifies 3-4 areas where the policy focus should be there in the Indian context. And I'll elaborate on that a little more, but there are essentially 4 things that I'm arguing there in terms of policy foci. One is restructuring of the higher education system. 2, doing something more significant in building the entrepreneurial ecosystem, because a large number of new innovations will come through kind of startups. Third, worry a bit about the cost of capital and cost of infrastructure, because that provides the basis for doing various innovation activities. And finally, think in terms of some kind of a mission-driven approach to focus on specific technology areas where we need to get good capabilities in place. And the argument there is that one should try and think through public-private partnerships. So broadly, these are the 3 things. Policymakers should understand what innovation means. Policymakers should look at all policy instruments that affect innovation, and therefore they need to worry about the consistency across policy instruments. And finally, some focus areas for policymakers in the immediate future. So let me spend some time on these three broad areas that I've just highlighted. So the firms that we look at generally in an empirical way, they undertake R&D, they buy technology, they imitate innovations from others, they get ideas from a variety of sources for innovation and so on. And the policymaker needs to understand that for a firm, the sources of innovation come from all diverse sources. And one needs to understand that if a policy sort of curtails certain sources of innovative ideas, you might create problem for the firms in terms of innovation potential in the long run. So just to give you an example, the survey which was done by the World Bank Enterprise Surveys, they found about 40 to 45% of the sample were reporting innovative products or services or innovative processes. So while the firms that report some innovation range between 45 to 50%, only about 30 odd percentage of firms actually report R&D. So obviously, for these firms, innovation is not essentially internally driven. They are finding other mechanisms through which they are able to get ideas for innovation. And this survey also talked about what are the sources of ideas for specific innovations. And only 14% of the firms in this survey said that the ideas for innovation that they work on come from internally. So only 14% of the ideas are internally driven. The other 86% come from their competitors, their suppliers, their customers, their partners in various kinds of ways in the supply chain and things like that. Also from the equipment suppliers, I mean the embodied technology and so on. So, so unless the policymakers understand that the sources of innovation are not only internally driven and they are therefore not only need to focus on R&D alone when they're looking at policy instruments, and whatever you do with other policy instruments, for example, technology purchase through licensing or technology purchase through importing capital goods from outside, that can contribute to ideas for R&D. So R&D, which is done internally, and other sources of ideas, including licensing of technology, which is patented and otherwise, they are complementary for creating innovations. If policymakers start to look at these sources as substitutes, there's a problem. I mean, so in the context of the current debate that is going on in terms of made in India or the idea of trying to do everything internally, it might seem that it will give you benefits in the shorter run because you'll start doing something internally and you will see some outcomes there. But in the longer run, any policy which curtails transfer of ideas from outside, restricts technology flows through imports or other mechanisms, is going to be problematic in terms of innovation outcomes. So that's one part where I argue that the understanding of the nature of innovation is very critical for policymakers to think through various policy instruments that are useful for the economy for innovation. The other part of the book goes at great length in reviewing the literature on how different policies affect innovation. And I argue that large number of policies affect innovation through broadly two mechanisms. Policies affect the nature of competition that the firms face, and policies affect the nature of knowledge that becomes available to firms. So I call these competition and contagion effects. So if policymakers create a situation where competition goes up, firms respond to these competition related issues by innovating. And on the other side, if policymakers facilitate knowledge flows, more knowledge becomes available, firms have something to build upon, complement their own efforts with what becomes available from outside, and therefore competition and contagion effects result in outcomes which can be innovative. So just to sort of exemplify this a bit, so look at policies with respect to FDI, right? So if the government of India liberalizes entry of multinationals. Now, what are you doing in the process is that when multinationals come in, they enhance the level of competition that the local firms face. So that's the competition effect. And firms might want to pull up their socks and say, okay, we have to compete with them, let us do something with respect to innovation. The other part of FDI is when they come in, they bring in new knowledge with them. They start working with their suppliers in the vicinity. They come up with new kinds of products, new management practices, and they often come up with doing R&D on your soil. So you bring in new knowledge, you bring in new technology. So that creates contagion effects, right? So FDI affects both competition and contagion. Similarly, take trade policy. If I'm able to import high-end machinery from outside, my ability to develop new products goes up. If I'm able to get good raw material and components, my ability to change processes internally or build on it through R&D goes up. So imports, once again, increase competition for those players in the economy who are making substitute products. But at the same time, good quality imports allows firms to build on those imports and create new kind of products. So what I'm trying to say is that virtually every policy you look at will have an impact on the nature of competition that the firms face and the kind of contagion or the knowledge spillovers possibilities that they create. And these effects are simultaneous. These are not sequential kind of an effect. So if I liberalize FDI policies, but I do not create an environment where firms are able to compete effectively by raising interest rates. So the cost of capital becomes more expensive for the domestic firm, or if the cost of infrastructure is very expensive for the domestic firm while they're competing from imports, then the local firms have a situation where they are dealing with competition with their hands tied, right? So so there has to be a consistency. I'm opening up the economy through FDI and I want my firms to pull up their socks and innovate. But in order to do that, they need certain things like cheap capital, good infrastructure. If you don't give them that, their ability to respond through innovation would decline, and therefore they'll start choosing other kinds of options to deal with this kind of competition. So similarly, if you are saying I have increased R&D subsidy by 100%, right? Now R&D subsidy is only a small part of the larger investment that is required to create a product, right? It's a but if your infrastructure costs are very high, if you cost of capital is very high, and I am not able to build the complementary assets to take my product to the market, then my ability to compete almost goes for a toss, right? So you have to worry about the consistency across policies. And the same issue that I have is with the Atmanirbhar Bharat policy. So if it ends up restricting trade, if it ends up restricting competition of some kind, both contagion and competition effects will be adversely affected. And in the long run, if you go by the experience of various countries in the world, we will suffer in the process. So that much for the consistency across various policy instruments. So we are sitting in a university which is trying to do a variety of experiments, and in some sense, adding to the larger ecosystem of national innovation system, as we call it. Many studies which have looked at India are basically arguing that probably higher education system is the weakest link in our innovation ecosystem in the country. Higher education not only provides the right kind of skills, but it can also do research which gets commercialized. It can also, through a variety of linkages with industry, develop different kind of innovations. But if you have a higher education system where research intensity is very high and the skills that are being generated are not very useful for the innovation system, then you create a situation where the firms are not able to respond. I mean, that becomes another part of what I call the contagion effect. I mean, the knowledge supply that is available for firms to leverage if they want to develop some innovation when they are faced with a variety of competition and contagion conditions, that gets adversely affected. So one needs to think about what one can do to facilitate innovation and research at the higher education kind of level. Now, in the context of the role of higher education system, we have this new education policy. And I have read the draft. Many of you may have read the draft as well. It has used a lot of very interesting words like holistic and multidisciplinary and so on, for which Pankaj and I have been very strongly arguing that innovation and entrepreneurship is essentially a multidisciplinary subject, and one needs to create an environment where people from different disciplines come together to think about a variety of innovations. But nowhere in this document they define what holistic means. Nowhere in the document they define what multidisciplinarity means. So one is not very sure about what is it that what they are trying to do. I mean, at one level they're saying they want to support research, and to my mind, research and teaching can coexist. This idea of a teaching university it is, to my mind, I'm using a strong word, a nonsensical idea. I mean, it has to be together. So the distinction between teaching and research university is something which is not very clear to me. And I personally think that one will have to think about other means to galvanize or create some kind of dynamics in the higher education system to make it much more innovative. And once again, I'll come to talk about it briefly towards the end. I think that some kind of public-private partnership might work there as well. The other policy space that the book touches upon at some length is the role of incubators and accelerators. I mean, I have been part of the incubation center at IIM Ahmedabad right from its beginning, and we have, in some sense, implemented policies regarding incubation and acceleration and so on. And what has happened is that the government of India has supported hundreds of incubators and accelerators across the country. And virtually any higher education institution of some repute has an accelerator or an incubator, right? And all these were created through higher education, through support from the Department of Science and Technology or some other kind of ministry. But the question is, are we able to foster innovation-driven startups through having 150 or 200 incubators? In universities, bulk of them don't do any research. Bulk of them do not have the capability to run these centers in a proper manner, because the expectation is that I give them money to set it up and they'll find ways to keep them financially viable. Now, if you are not able to get good people to create a situation where you are able to raise resources on a continuing basis and expand the scope and scale of the incubators activities, you are sort of tied to some kind of a low level equilibrium where you're neither able to reap economies of scale nor economies of scope. And the incubation center essentially does not do anything significant in terms of creating innovation-driven startups. And so these are not even, they are not financially viable. And since they are not linked to the rest of the ecosystem of the educational institution, they are not organizationally viable as well, because the rest of the institution thinks, what is this animal doing on our campus? I mean, what is it that they are contributing to our ecosystem, right? So you have to have a situation where research is happening and the incubation center is linked to teaching and research of the institution. Only then it is economically and financially viable. So one of the things that I have been arguing, and it's there in the book as well, that to make incubators financially viable and increase the scope and scale of the activities that they perform is to try and do some kind of venture capital activity along with it. Because if you are able to raise resources to invest in the startups in a significant manner, you do two things. You attract good startups to your incubator, and through the money that you raise from the investors for venture capital fund, you are able to attract decent talent and retain it, so which basically means that you are able to run the incubator kind of a well. And if you have these activities, you can then try and use these activities for teaching and research purposes for the rest of the institution. So you can do courses around venture capital, you can do courses around startups, you can do a variety of courses around entrepreneurship and sort of use live situations that your incubator is able to provide. So the transition of incubators into a stage where some kind of venture funds are available might make them both financially more viable and organizationally more viable. And I also have argued very strongly here that instead of supporting individual incubators in individual higher education institutions, there should be an effort to create cluster level incubators for two reasons. One, you are able to reap economy of scale and you are not creating something which is doomed to fail right from the beginning. You're also forcing institutions of different disciplines to come together. So think about Ahmedabad. If you have a large incubation centers and we are able to cross organizational boundaries, which I know fairly well are difficult to do, then you have Ahmedabad University, National Institute of Design, IIT Gandhinagar, IIM Ahmedabad coming together and doing things which can be remarkably different from what an individual institution can do. And it brings in multidisciplinarity. It creates an ethos of a large university having multiple disciplines, which, I mean, we don't have that kind of a university in our country, right? So that becomes a kind of a situation where one can reap benefits from multidisciplinarity, economies of scale and scope, and also be financially viable and organizationally viable, as I call it. And finally, the issue of financing innovation. The issue of financing is there as a concern across economies, developing economies particularly. And as I said a little while ago, financing of innovation does not only mean financing R&D. It also means that you develop from R&D, you give to a prototype and then develop it into a product, and then you figure out how to produce it, so get the machinery right, and then you figure out how to market it, so get the marketing and distribution networks going in place, then you do branding. So you have a whole host of activities which will make an innovation successful in the market. So if the policymakers is thinking about, okay, I have given R&D subsidy, and this fellow has to worry about the rest of it, and the cost of capital is very high, then it's not going to happen. The firm will start thinking about what will it cost me to take the product to the market. I mean, large number of pharma products, I mean, the clinical trials are so damn expensive that very few companies are able to sort of take it to the stage where they can actually take it to the market on their own. So if one is thinking about narrowly about IP, so I have created an intellectual property right which gives them good protection. They should be developing products. They have given them R&D subsidy. They should be doing good research. That's a very narrow way of looking at the situation that the firms are faced with, because R&D subsidy and IPRs do not compensate for the high cost of capital and infrastructure that we face. And unless we are able to tackle that, will not be able to do much. Now, there is a lot of discussion in India about financing startups. I mean, we have created a fund of funds. 10,000 crores was announced some years ago that this will be available to a minuscule of that has been invested. I mean, not much has happened because they did not think through the organizational structure that is required to put that money into the market in the right kind of startups. So we at the center here, we experimented with a public-private partnership model where the government grants were leveraged to create a fund, and then in a manner that the investment committee, which is not tied to the investors, we were able to invest in startups. And so I argue in the book that even for creating, leveraging this 10,000 crores, some kind of a public-private partnership would be useful, where then this money from the government is used to give the investors this notion that if something fails, the government will take the first loss. So, I mean, I go into great details about how you structure this and so on, which I don't want to do at this point in time. If there are questions, we can certainly think about it. The core argument is that the PPP should be designed in such a manner that the distortions that the government intervention can create and distortions that can be created by private greed in some sense are taken care of. So there are structural options available there. And finally, one way of funding research is through large investments by governments. I mean, world over, a large number of countries have used mission-driven approaches to create innovative products and so on. And so if one is able to create a mission-driven approach, and the government of India says that this is how we are going to do it, and create a platform where private entities can come in and contribute as well. So one should try and create a mission-driven approach where the government is funding, government is not doing R&D. I mean, it's the notion that I will fund and I'll also decide what to do research on, and I'll also decide what I should patent. That sort of doesn't work because the government doesn't know how to do research, right? So the only way one can leverage large government funds for R&D is to use that as a kind of a leverage to raise resources from the commercial market in some sense, and also strategic capital. I mean, firms will come in and join. We'll have to think about some ways of thinking through the mission-driven approach. There are certain sectors which I think we should very quickly get into mission-driven approaches. Otherwise, we'll, just like we missed the semiconductor bus, we'll miss many other buses. I'll stop here. Thank you for listening to me so patiently.
Thank you very much, Rakesh. I think what an expansive view you gave us, which tells us about the understanding of innovation, how we need to address a variety of different kind of policies, and how does that impact firm choices and firm decision making, which then impacts the economy. I'm going to come to Naushad, and you are on mute. Yeah. Okay. And I mean, I think Rakesh has really drawn out the entire technology supply chain and showed what kind of weaknesses really were laid out are there in this system. And I mean, you've been, Naushad, you understand technology, industrialization, innovation, economy linkage very deeply. You also lead a firm that does innovation. So you face all these challenges from capital to capabilities to everything together. And at the same time, you've seen how decisions are made. I mean, in addition to hearing your thoughts on Rakesh's book, etc., but I'd also like to know, in your mind, where does this innovation challenge of India lies? And I'm always wonder, why is it that 1.3 billion people can't steamroll through our efforts, everything else that's happening around the world? Where is it that our traffic has gotten stuck? So over to you, Naushad.
Thank you, Pankaj. And first of all, it's a privilege to be part of a panel discussing Rakesh's book. Rakesh is a researcher that I greatly respect. And I think this is a subject that we really need in the country. But more than a privilege, it's a complete pleasure to be part of this session with you both. As you mentioned, Pankaj, in your introduction, this is a chat between friends. Unfortunately, if anyone wants a debate, they're not going to get a debate. They're going to get much too much agreement between the three of us. Let me start by saying that I not only agree with pretty well everything in Rakesh's book, but I think it's wonderfully timed, it's wonderfully needed, and I'll come back to why in a couple of minutes. So let me start by making a background comment and then answer your question specifically, Pankaj. If you look at, I think, first of all, Rakesh's point that innovation is not only about in-house R&D. It's a much broader subject, is a very important one, which we have to keep reminding ourselves of. That there are flows of technology and innovation that happen from startups, that you have flows of technology from imports and licensing. You have a whole bunch of sectors like the fashion industry and apps and everything else that are non-R&D sectors, if you like, where you get very innovative outputs, but without anything that we would normally describe as R&D. And then information flows, as Rakesh also mentioned, from buyers, especially if they're demanding buyers like export buyers. So many of those areas. But I think also R&D does matter. And the investment in R&D matters. And I think it's good to start in understanding innovation in India. It's good to start with some numbers on how India differs. So first of all, R&D in India is a pretty modest enterprise. We invest between 0.7 and 0.9% of GDP in R&D as a country. That's been the percentage for the last 40 years, essentially. Many other countries, especially many other emerging markets, have seen substantial increases in investment in R&D over this period of time as they've gone into more and more sophisticated fields. We have not. So we've kept pace with the growth in GDP, but we've not gone ahead of the growth in GDP, which you would expect to accompany restructuring and an industrial structure that is quite skill and capital intensive as ours is. Second, we have a relatively small share of in-house R&D done within industry in our overall R&D picture. We invest about 0.3% of GDP in in-house R&D, Indian industry invests, compared with 1.5% for the world, also 1.5% for China. Third, we invest a fairly small share of public R&D in the higher education sector. And it relates directly to Rakesh's point about when he said, I think the higher education sector is one of the weakest links. I'm not sure I agree with the weakest link comment, because I think we actually end up producing a lot of very valuable talent. but it's certainly the area where we have the most direct and immediate potential to improve the innovation ecosystem for the country and the wider national innovation system. It's an easy win if we choose to take it. We invest 0.05% of GDP in research done within the higher education sector in India, compared to 0.4% worldwide. Again, so this basically says we need to scale in-house R&D in industry by a factor of 5. We need to scale research done within the higher education sector by a factor of 8 to match the world average. And not only do we not do enough of public research in higher education, but we tend to neglect certain fields. And the field that we neglect most, if you ask me, is the broader field of the health sciences. About 2 to 3% of public R&D in India is done on the health sciences, compared with typically anywhere between 30 and 50% of public R&D funding in most of the West. So you have a hugely different pattern of which sectors. So to come back to Rakesh's last point on, a few big sectors where the state should be funding R&D much more generously, the health sciences, in my view, should be at the top of the list. The health sciences broadly defined. So now to come to your very specific question, looking at government, I think government, my sense, going around and talking to many people in the government about these kinds of issues and innovation issues more broadly, is that there is very limited understanding of where R&D should be done, of the role of public research, of the connection between science and technology, of the connection between public research and private development. And even worse, there is not only, I think, limited understanding, there is overall limited interest in gaining that understanding. If I think our government thinks about innovation at all, apart from, being like motherhood in favor of it, if we think about it at all, I think the general perception would be that the private sector isn't doing enough. Now, I think, by the way, that perception is accurate. The private sector is not doing enough. And that's why I made that point that we need to scale our investments in in-house R&D from 0.3 to 1.5% of GDP. We need to scale it 5 times. And we have an opportunity because we have the availability actually of talent in abundance. And if GE and Cummins and AstraZeneca and and Emerson and a whole bunch of foreign firms can set up large R&D and engineering setups in India, employing 3,000 and 5,000 and 10,000 and 20,000 engineers each, why aren't we as Indian industry doing that first? Because the opportunity certainly exists for us. Now, from private industry, when we went around and talked to people, and when I talked about this in groups of private industry, the general sense, I think, is that we think we're investing enough. And when we would actually provide data and say, well, you're a firm in the auto sector. This is the average for the auto sector in terms of investments in R&D worldwide. This is where you are. That would prompt a good discussion, but one needs to get very tangible and specific in pointing this out. And I think there would be a perception that enough public research isn't happening and that there isn't adequate support for doing R&D. But I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think we should be focusing our effort on getting the public research moved to the higher education space. So all of this adds up, I want to stop here because we want to get into the discussion. But all of this adds up to saying that we need a much deeper and wider understanding of all these kinds of issues. Deeper in terms of really understanding the kinds of things that Rakesh was talking about just now. That depth of understanding, which is on display in Rakesh's book, is something that needs to be appreciated and understood and read and absorbed by anyone involved in policies that affect innovation. And as Rakesh said, that doesn't mean just officials in the Department of Science and Technology. In fact, it's probably a mistake to have a Department of Science and Technology because it makes you think you're doing innovation policy. When because the innovation policies that matter, as Rakesh very accurately and insightfully said, extends far beyond what you would normally call technology policy, what would you would normally call policies that have to do with science and technology. I think it requires the other word that Rakesh used, nuance, because understanding the subtleties of what's actually involved is very important. And it needs to be, again, something that he said, accessible to all, right? It needs to be something that can be read and appreciated by everyone. And that's why I think, Rakesh's book is so welcome, because it combines this real deep understanding of international work that's been done in the field with the Indian experience. And that combination of really having deep understanding of what work's been done in the field, what's understood of innovation and how it happens worldwide, and then combining it with the Indian experience is essential for us to really move our innovation policy forward. And that's why I think the book is indeed so welcome. So I will stop there and look forward to getting into our discussion. But again, it's a real pleasure to be here. And next time, I agree with you, I'll be there in person.
Thank you. We're looking forward to it. Let me put some data before you, and I'm so glad both of you talked about sectors of focus, and Naushad, you mentioned health. I just pulled out some data from Janak's Steer most recent report that has come out, and I want to just read out a few things for you, which will put perhaps what both Rakesh and Naushad are saying in perspective. So India's R&D intensity, I have just read out the list of sectors, and R&D intensity is fraction of research expenditure on R&D to sales. All right, what fraction of sales you are putting in R&D? Let me read out the top sectors. So the highest is pharma and biotech. Next is auto and parts. Then oil and gas, software, aerospace and defense, industrial engineering, chemical, food, and last is electronics and electrical. Okay. Now look at the sectors where they are, and this ties to Rakesh, your comment on higher education. There's a table there in that report which talks about the cumulative list number of publications in various domains from 2015 to 2019. So here is your sequence of sectors, most highest investment. Look at number one, where the publications are occurring, which is telling us where R&D from academic institutions or some companies happening. Number one, electronics and electrical. Number two, multidisciplinary material science. Number three, computer science and theory. Number four, telecom. Number five, applied physics. Number six, multidisciplinary chemical. Keep this in mind, number six. Number seven, computer science and AI. Number nine, energy and fuels. Number 10, computer science and information systems. Now, pharma, number one, R&D intensity. But in terms of publications, I think number six, perhaps some of this chemistry related work is being published in that domain. Let me give you one other similar list. Application of patents in India in 2019, right? Number one area in which most patents were applied, mechanical engineering. Number two, it is communication. Number three, chemicals. Number 4, so perhaps chemicals is where some of this biochemical sciences patenting may be happening. Number 4, computers and electronics. Number 5, electricals. Number 6, physics. Number 7, pharma. In terms of sectors where startups are happening, large, which are attracting largest funding. Number 1, consumer. Number 2, fintech. Number 3, retail. Number 4, travel and hospitality. Number 5, enterprise. Number 6, auto. Number 7, food. Number 8, real estate. Number 9, health. And number 10, gig economy, and so on and so forth. The point I'm wanting to make is, I think here is a sector which is supposed to be providing the max amount of R&D intensity, but is not being supported by the amount of research, patenting, and startups in that domain. And I think there's a mismatch that seems to be happening. And again, my question, both Rakesh, to you and Naushad, is, I mean, are these the kind of mismatches that you're seeing from a policy point of view? Because somewhere this, if alignment happens, if assume for a moment, pharma is the highest intensity, also leads to largest amount of patenting, also leads to largest amount of papers being published. My God, we're booming then, we're going somewhere else. Or I think it's too simplistic a way to draw this connect.
Naushad, you want to go first? It's a difficult question.
No,
Anyway,
No,
so
no.
let me.
now you can blame Janak for it.
Yeah, it's a good.
Okay, so 2-3 caveats before I answer the question. One is that the patenting intensity varies across sectors because certain sectors are considered to be more appropriate for patenting to protect your technology. So if the research is the same across all sectors, there are certain sectors where you will see more patenting, right? So part of the mismatch is structural, so to say, because there are certain sectors which are more appropriate for patenting to protect your invention. But having said that, the other thing which came to mind when you were talking about this was that, just like I was saying, that there seems to be some kind of a mismatch between firms doing R&D and firms reporting innovation. So if you add the third dimension, firms reporting patenting, then you will see a significantly higher mismatch, right? So you have a situation where more firms report innovation than firms who report R&D, than firms who report patenting. So there is a kind of a hierarchy is there. The other interesting fact that came to mind when you were mentioning this was that when Dr. Mashelkar became the Director General of CSIR, he started a campaign, all the CSIR firms should start patenting, and they patented left, right, and center, whether they were in mechanical, whatever field they were in. And the exercise that was done some years down the line showed that 80% of those patents were actually not useful at all. I mean, they will not be commercializable. So since bulk of the patenting, at least domestic patenting, is coming from the government system, the CSIR lab system, which is partly pushed by the government and partly not thinking about what the commercial application should be, there will be a mismatch. So from that perspective, if the CSIR labs were thinking about commercializability and thinking about which industries are requiring innovation and so doing research in that area, you will see a mismatch. From that perspective, I agree with you that the universities do research and CSIR labs do research, not thinking about commercial. And therefore, there is likely to be a situation where certain pharma is R&D, most R&D intensive, but those people are not worried about whether it should go to the market or whatever research they do. So the market orientation, or for want of any other word, industry application orientation being so low that the industry research, university research and the CSI labs research is sort of kind of disjointed. But essentially it amounts to the same thing. There is kind of a disconnect, right? There is, and that's the reason why university-industry linkages do not happen. I mean, it's like, I mean, I know I sort of, Naushad?
So Pankaj, I think your lists, the 4 categories, are very interesting. And as you say, you would want to see the list to broadly match. Yeah. And the someone whose work you both know, Keith Pavitt at Sprue, wrote an article many years ago where he made the argument. He asked the question, what is the role of scientific research in the innovation process, in industrial innovation? He says, does scientific research lead industrial innovation, or does it follow it? And does the scientific research system indeed lead, or does it follow? And he made the argument that his reading of the evidence was that it should actually follow. In other words, you first need successful firms. After you have successful firms, those firms, some of them will start investing more and more in innovation and in R&D. The firms that are investing more and more in innovation and R&D will then create a pull on the output of research that would be done in higher education, done in research labs. So the sequence is, first you need the successful firms, then you need the successful investment in R&D, in-house R&D in those firms, and then you need the scientific research in those fields. If you just go for the scientific research in those fields, and then expect it to somehow show up in industrial innovation, it probably won't happen. So I think that's where I would make the argument that the reason we should do much more of public research in health sciences is precisely because that's the field where we have such strong R&D investing firms. We have a pharmaceutical sector that invests whatever the percentage is, 8 or 9% of sales in R&D. That creates a draw and a receptivity and an absorptive capacity in industry that can make use of the output of scientific research, and would also make use and hire the researchers if we did that scientific research in the higher education system. So, if you go around and talk to pharmaceutical firms, they'll tell you that their number one constraint in doing higher quality R&D is not the ability to hire people. It's the ability to hire people with specialized technical, advanced scientific and technical skills. That's their number one constraint. And that constraint can be addressed only if within the higher education system, we do a lot more research. And that research will have to come from the state. People have this mental idea that, in the US, higher education research is wonderfully connected with private industry, which is funding all this research. It's not true. The great bulk of research that's done within private universities in the US, for example, is funded by the government. It's funded by the federal government in the US. And I mean, you look at Stanford, over 80% of its research budget, and its research budget, by the way, exceeds the combined research budget of every higher education institution in India. It's $1.7 billion a year to $1.3 billion a year in India. I mean, that's the number, right? That 80% of that 1.7 billion comes from the federal government. So I think, coming back to this again, I think it's a very insightful point, that we need to pick our areas carefully And we need to fund those areas where we have a really successful industry. So we should really be funding a lot more research in health sciences, a lot more research in the auto sector, a lot more research in software.
Yeah.
Because these are the sectors where we have a good, successful industry.
And I think the point you made, if the MNC can come and hire and do research in India, why would we not do? I mean, other day, Intel was saying that they are now hiring, they have a manpower of 10,000 engineers with master's level degrees working here and doing everything from chip design to low level kind of fabrication and everything else. And equipment, they're now working towards design of equipment for that industry. So the role of
see, the only caveat I'll put in there is that the last point which Naushad made, the multinationals have the advantage of having people with those kinds of skills which Naushad talked about in their parent company, and they are able to leverage whatever capabilities we are able to generate through various higher education systems. We have very few people of the kind which Naushad is talking about. Multinationals have that capability, and therefore they're able to use our manpower much more effectively. And if our pharma companies have the same kind of skills which Naushad is talking about, our ability to leverage these skills will go up. So I still think, may not be the weakest link, but that's a weak link that exists.
Let me not leave at that note, but I think India since 1991, it's now close to 25, 26 years that much of this change has been happening, and you can now see the nature of startups that are starting to come across different domains, even in life sciences. The kind of very interesting startups today happening in Bugworks, for instance, is a very interesting company working on antimicrobial resistance and so on and so forth. So do you see another decade or two these kind of deep skills coming in? Because at the end of the day, it's these set of people who will mature to become the leaders, those who are just about joining now in 2 decades. They'll be the leader working on this deep technology in these labs here in India, which might create a very different, so maybe it's just that it's a matter of time.
Right. So, you're very right. One sees these kinds of trends happening. Since I'm part of the investment committee of some of these funds, increasingly in recent times, the applications that we have received are really, really high tech. They are cutting edge kind of situations. But the only difference there is that in almost, we must have looked at about 50 odd these cases in the last 2-3 years or so. About 90% of the so-called cutting edge ones have an international connect. They will have somebody in MIT or somebody in Stanford or somebody in Harvard or some other university in the West as an advisor or as a partner or as something. We are probably getting there. We still lack I think some cutting edge capability to do it completely on our own. And that's what worries me. If you cut off that possibility, then whatever one is seeing in terms of trends of this new startup, earlier startups were all those web-based kind of stuff, which is changing. And fortunately, it's a very, very good trend. But if we start looking inwards only and sort of cut off our economy from the rest of the world, this trend will start to change, right? But you're right, very, very interesting startups.
I want to come back to it for a minute, but I don't want to keep everybody here waiting, as well as some who are online. If you have any comments or any questions, please do make, and I will continue a conversation a little bit longer. Ravi Miglani from Ahmedabad University, please.
Hi, I'm Ravi. a very layman question, and I'm probably exaggerating the point to make the point. So I'm not being flippant. But when I first saw your book and your subtitle, Innovation and Public Policy, I felt there's a contradiction in terms between innovation and public policy. These two words sound like oxymorons. It harks back to, again, for a layman, it harks back to the good old or the bad old days of where public policy decided whether innovation was needed in machine tools because it's important for national development, not needed in scooters and televisions because those are flippant goods and for the rich people. And public policy, many of the things that you said, Rakesh, in your presentation, that policy that allows firms to do this or encourages firms to do this. Why should public policy allow or encourage? Shouldn't public policy's only job be to get out of the way? And because I can understand in countries which have high state capacity, like the Scandinavian countries, for example, where they are able to lead these. In India, both at the policy formulation is so messy that the policy that comes out, by the time it comes out, has become messed up. And policy implementation is even messier than policy formulation. So why depend on public policy for innovation? Why doesn't the government get out of the way and let the firms do what they want? They will innovate. We were in the old days when public policy was deciding things, we were stuck with the same Bajaj scooter for 30 years. No innovation was happening because that was not priority area and so on. So that is my point. Why does innovation have to depend on public policy?
So it depends on what your conceptualization of public policy is. And if you are looking at public policy with the mindset of the pre-1991 days, then of course what you're saying is right. I mean, if it is only licensing and quotas and things of that kind, then I completely agree with you. But public policy worldwide these days is seen with a much more broader kind of a perspective, including, as I said, so nowhere in the book I am saying that the policymakers should create a licensing system or they create a permit. What I'm saying is it should become a set of policies which are consistent with each other and focus on policies which are basic in the sense that infrastructure has significant market failure situations, right? I mean, worldwide countries have seen government intervention there. You have a situation where interest rates are decided by the state. I mean, you can't do any other way, right? So long as they're able to do things right on this space, it affects the ability of the firms to respond to whatever stimulus or impetus they are getting. So, and even the only place where I'm arguing in terms of some kind of a focus by the government in specific sectors, which Naushad talked about, in the mission mode, I'm arguing that it should not be done by the government. I'm talking about a PPP mode, which is more market driven. But as Naushad said, worldwide, particularly in the US, a large part of private R&D is funded by public R&D, right? And to some extent, they broadly approve the proposal of some kind, right? I mean, there is a process through which they do that, but they're not interviewing at a micro kind of a level. So the role of the government in intervening in spaces where market failures are very high still remains, irrespective of which part of the world you're looking at. I understand your point about the state capacity issue. When government failures can also be as high. And therefore, one needs to figure out a structure where both parties work with each other. So, I mean, we can have a larger debate on what public policy means. But I mean, for me, it's a plethora of things, a spectrum of interventions, and control is only one end of the spectrum. Naushad?
Yeah, so just building on Rakesh's comment, public policy comes in all shapes and sizes. And public policy for innovation has taken the form of picking winners, saying, this is the field, this is the sector, this is the product that we want more of, want more development, etc. And so let's go and do it. As Rakesh said, do it as opposed to fund it. But even funding it is an element of picking winners. You're saying that this is somehow desirable. And Ravi is quite right, which is that not only our experience, but the experience of several other countries in the world is that governments are much better at picking losers than winners. And so it's true of us, it's true of many other countries too, right? And so what then is the right role, right? And the right role is indeed this funding role. And the funding role needs to split between funding in industry when you're doing technological research. So for example, if you look at public R&D in India, public R&D in India is, who are the top funders? The top funders are 50% of public R&D is DRDO, defense. So defense, space, atomic energy. Between the three is about 50%. CSR would come next with around 10%, which would be sort of scientific research. And then things that come under DST, Department of Biotechnology, a few areas like that would be another 5%, right? So we have so if you take the total, it would be significantly technological research, because that's what defense research is. That's what atomic energy research is. That's what also to a large extent space research is, though there's some scientific research that's done there too. And that should be done in industry. Public industry by all means, but also private industry. It should be funded by the government, but done in industry. And we'd actually be much more successful with a lot of our defense development, for example, if that's how we approached it. The scientific research should not be done again in these autonomous labs of CSIR and DBT and so on. It should be done in the higher education sector alone. And to give Ravi some satisfaction, the goal of public scientific research should be to open as many windows as possible.
Yeah.
So you want to do something which really you fund many fields. You don't try to pick winners. You fund good people and good proposals. And that's all you're interested in. Will knowledge benefit from this particular scientific research? If it will, fund it. Yeah. You don't say, will it be useful? Useful is a technology question.
Thanks very much. And just to add to what you said, Naushad, if you look at the example of US, the big labs are all affiliated with universities now, whether it is the Fermi Lab or the Argonne National Lab or the Oak Ridge Lab or the Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech. I think it's that linkage which also creates enormous amount of public and institutional gains. Any other question, Raghu? Raghu Rangarajan, yeah.
So we're talking about innovation in public policy, and both of you have talked about changes that have to come in public policy. Both of you have also indicated that the government or the policymakers aren't at this point really interested in some of these ideas. So how are we going to bring about this change? If policy has to change, if we have all the solutions, it still doesn't add up to actual change in policy unless we come up with a way of convincing these people. Or convincing policymakers. With regards to higher ed, should it be from people who are education leaders? If it is industry, should industry bodies like CII, etc., be pushing for this so that at some point policymakers will implement some of the changes that are being suggested in your book?
Yeah, so as an academic, you're right. The only thing we can do is to basically argue what we think is the right public policy approach, and to the extent possible, evangelize that argument. But beyond the point, the role
good sense prevails. Hopefully, good sense.
Hopefully, good sense prevails.
Nasha?
The way that reform happens in our country is not a logical, systematic process, but it's still a forward direction process. My sense from whatever interaction I've had is that you need three things to line up, 3 planets to line up for reform to happen. you need a minister who wants to do something. You need a secretary of department, or at least a couple of joint secretaries who are knowledgeable about the subject and also want to do something. And you need preparation and work that's been done that says, here's what needs to be done in this area. And it needs to be all prepared, whether it's with CI, or whether it's with NASCOM, or whether it's with, Rakesh connecting with his friends in the ministry. It doesn't matter, but it needs to be, that preparation needs to be in place. And when those three things come together, then reform happens. That's the sense I have. It's, if any one of those three is missing, it doesn't happen. So you can have a committed, keen minister, but the bureaucrats don't understand the subject or what's going on or what needs to be done in the area, nothing will happen. You have minister and bureaucrats both committed and keen to do something, but the preparation has not been done, right? And because of our limited implementation capacity and state capacity, again, nothing happens. So the argument that I used to always make at CI was that our job was to be fully prepared. Our job was to have clear recommendations and full preparation and all the data and exactly what changes were needed worked out. Even if they were not being, happily received at the time, but they needed to be worked out and we needed to be prepared. So that then if these other two constellations of minister and bureaucrat lined up, we were ready.
Very, very pragmatic way of going forward. Yeah, Dinesh Avasti.
Talking about another issues. See, there are two major streams of innovations, and as far as industry is concerned, one are SMEs.
Can you keep it a little bit closer?
SMEs. We have been taught that most of the innovations take place in SMEs and all that. The other is large industries who invest huge and all that. How do you think policies have any role as far as SMEs are concerned? Because they innovate despite government, right? So what kind of policy interventions you think are required at the moment, especially in the country or India? Second issue, which I wanted to have a clarification, you were talking about clusters of incubators. I have also been associated with this whole movement the last 15, 20 years now. What exactly you have in mind? I mean, see, you have IIM, IIT, NID, others, and then you create one space incubator where everybody comes in and contributes. To my mind, given the organizational structure and the equations within these inter-organizational
these important institutions.
I mean, it might not work. I mean, this is my hunch, because we tried to bring most of the institutions at one platform for discussions. It didn't work. Once you create a kind of cluster in Ahmedabad, we have one cluster or two clusters, three clusters. In Bombay, you have 5 clusters. How do you make organizations to work together? That is a big issue. You don't see, everybody has ego. How do you get out of that ego? NIT doesn't want to talk to IIM, IIM doesn't want to talk to IIT. It happens. So how your cluster of incubation clusters might work? These are my tools.
Okay, your question is very valid, and I mentioned that crossing organizational boundaries are difficult, and all kinds of issues come up. In the book, I have talked about an experiment which is being done in UK, where it is not setting up a physical incubation center. It's not a question of saying, okay, here's a space and everybody comes from. What they have done is they said that these are the areas which, when they decide in their system with the private sector, these are the areas we want to do research. And we have identified these 4 or 5 universities which have different capabilities. And we'll fund a very large, long duration research project, which can lead to commercialization of certain things, provided all of you work together, right? So it's an incentive for the universities to participate in it because they're getting resources. And of course, when I spoke to them, some of those universities, it turned out that if there was good chemistry, much more happened. But all the universities participated in the process because they were getting reasonably large research grants for a longish period of time. And so some of them really worked together, some of them partitioned work and then came together. But the public policy mattered here because they said so many £1 million are available, but you have to work together. It won't be given to one institution. And so I had something similar in mind. So as Naushad said, health sciences, right? Suppose the government of India says that in Ahmedabad cluster, you have pharmaceutical industry, you have Ahmedabad University of IT, you have Ahmedabad NID. We want to do significant work in this broad area of health sciences. And you are researchers, you have incubators and so on. Can you come together to say, okay, we'll address this so-called mission? And there are resources available if you're willing to participate. Go through a process of working out something which makes sense. So that's the thing I had in mind. But you're absolutely right. We tried A-League, it did not work. On the other question of SMEs, I have been looking at these numbers somewhat more carefully. SMEs being more innovative is a kind of a folklore, right? But if you start looking at what kind of innovations, then you get a more nuanced picture. SMEs are more innovative if you look at incremental and somewhat less radical innovations. Then they are more, because they are working, they're adapting things, they're changing things, and so on. But if you look at the radical innovations, in the US context, some of the radical innovations have come from startups, not necessarily from SMEs, otherwise large companies. I mean, so even if the startups come in, large companies acquire them and then take it to the market. But irrespective of the size, particularly for SMEs, in order to be innovative, I still think cost of capital and cost of infrastructure are really, really important. And a trade policy which allows them access to good quality raw materials and capital goods, because many of them are not able to benefit from those knowledge sources.
Any thoughts, Naushad? Yeah.
I think that was the perfect answer on the SME question. I'll just add a point on the cluster, the education cluster, question. And I can add this comment for 2 reasons. One is because it'll be a particular pleasure to make the comment, given that there are many people from higher education and professors in the audience. And second, because I'm at least 800 kilometers away. So this is John Hennessy, who used to be president of Stanford, he used to have this statement that he would make, and he'd say, getting my professors to do anything is like trying to herd cats. And then he'd say, there's only one way in which you can herd cats. You have to move the food. And so to just come back to Rakesh's point, that if you want clusters to develop, and if you want professors to get together and work in a particular field or area or collaborate, you need lots of food. That's what...
I think you're so right. I'll give you 2 very quick examples. In Canada, after year 2000, they stopped setting up centers of excellence in institutions. SSHRC and NSERC, which is their main funding bodies, only would do networks of centers.
Right.
And for the exactly the reason that Rakesh mentioned. Second, a very good experiment was that all universities of Montreal, and there were 6 of them, they all came together and started a PhD program in management. And they had to go take courses across different universities, and the federal government put in certain amount of money for this particular purpose. So I think this resource being the glue is a very crucial one. But unless there's any other question or comment, if you have, please raise your hand, or I have another question for Rakesh, and maybe we'll then close because it's already way past our planned time. But okay, nobody asked, then I'll ask. You know, Rakesh, I mean, this small enterprise has been a real concern of ours for a long time. And you and I looked at Wenzhou, we looked at Tama, Dinesh, you have also been looking at Rajkot, looked at Pune, and all of these places were really havens for small producers who are phenomenal experts in their own domains. I mean, you'll find, they said about Tama, which is the area outside Tokyo, that you drop a blueprint and you'll find somebody who will definitely innovate and make it. What can make that happen? Because end of the day, small, really the very small can't compete with large producers doing standard products. So they'll have to do incremental or some innovation, process innovation, or do something. What can bring this together? I mean, because this is, small is an engine,
Right,
of change, innovation at that particular level.
so certainly, I mean, and small firms, although I said that in terms of distribution of innovations, the radical innovations may not fall in the small category. There are a large number of small firms which are extremely innovative. But I personally don't see a lot of scope for, some of them, of course, will grow up and become large firms. I still think the network is the only way to go. I mean, they'll have to be either networked with each other or tied to a larger entity, so that, and I mean,
Which all these cases are.
All these cases are. I mean, so the Japanese experiment, large amount of auto sector, you told me about, and we have been reading that, a lot of innovation by the small firms happened because of the linkage with the large firms. And over time, a large amount of design tasks and sub-assembly tasks were passed on to them because they were comfortable with each other, and there was issue of opportunistic behavior was not there. So one will have to think through those kinds of, and Naushad will be able to tell us under what circumstances these linkages grow, and where there's a policy space which can facilitate that, whether it's a labor policy, or I don't know. I mean, to my mind, that's the only way we can leverage the innovativeness of the small and the agileness of the small firms.
Right.
I mean, I think exactly as you said, right? I think it should start with large firms wanting to do more themselves, you know, and investing more in in-house R&D, because that will create the pull for small firms to apply their own specialized skills in making something happen, in making a part that you want, in making something which has a particular functionality. So I think that demand has to come, I agree, from the large firms. You know, one comment too, which is that I think a great model is not so small or large, but middle. You know, if you take the Mittelstand, the German model, the German Mittelstand, it's a great model of very innovative mid-sized firms. Now, mid-sized means a very different thing to what we normally call mid-sized. In Germany, a mid-sized firm would be a firm with a turnover somewhere between 50 million euros, so say 400, 500 crores a year, through to about 2 billion euros. Right. So through to say 15,000 crores, I mean, which we would definitely consider a very large firm. So, you know, so that's the kind of range. But if you take firms that say are in the 1,000 crore, 2,000 crore, 4,000 crore, not 50, 100,000 crores, but 500 to 5,000 crores, let's say that range as good medium-sized firms, I think our expectations of innovation should be much greater. I think we have many great examples of highly innovative, successful firms in that range.
Yep.
And we should really be looking at how they can produce real winners, and winners that can work worldwide and that can over time build that same kind of Mittelstand growth engine for the wider Indian economy.
Well, I think what a fabulous place to end this conversation, the magical middle of the Indian industry. And I think, thank you very much, Rakesh, for putting this book together for all of us. Really enjoyed reading it and talking to you. Thank you, Naushad. Your comments and thoughts are always so very enlightening and so much on target. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody here. There's tea and coffee and other things outside. Please do join us. So, quiche and other things are pending for you when you come here, Naushad.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, Naushad.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.